Okay, good morning everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's fantastic to be here. This is a beautiful city. My first time in Wellington, I'm sorry to say, and I haven't had a chance to see very much of it, but what I have seen has been lovely. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here, and it looks like a terrific program, so I'm really looking forward to hearing the speakers today and the discussions, and I hope I get a chance to meet and talk with many of you. So what I wanted to do in my talk is three things. I want to start off by saying something about why we still need to focus on social disadvantage and inequality, and why a life course approach is so important for understanding social disadvantage, inequality and poverty. So I will make some comments about that to begin with. The second part of my talk, I want to talk about the Life Course Centre that I direct. I'm very proud of our centre. We're funded primarily by the Australian Research Council. It's a partnership across 4 universities, headquartered at the University of Queensland, but there are 4 universities involved, many government departments and a number of NGOs. So I will talk a little bit about the centre, the scope and the vision and how we're running. We've been running since 2014. It's a 7-year funded centre, and I'm just in the middle actually of writing a new application for more funding from 2021 to 28, and I can't quite get my head around 2028, but that's what I'm working on. The third area that I want to talk about is some of the research coming out of the centre. And I'm going to focus on some of the big flagship projects. These are the multidisciplinary, multinodal projects involving partners. They're large-scale ongoing projects. So I'll say something about those. And then just to finish off, I want to turn to the area of family dynamics, which is my particular research interest and expertise. I'm a sociologist by training, and I want to show you some results from some smaller scale, discrete pieces of research looking at how family dynamics influences social disadvantage in various ways. So, let me begin. And of course this is not moving forward. Here we go. Okay. So, why do we need to focus on life course research? Australia, like New Zealand, is a developed modern country. It has a stable political system, give or take rapid changes in prime ministers. Leaving that aside, we've got high levels of natural resources, a very strong economy. We didn't suffer from the global financial crisis, unlike many other countries. We've got probably one of the lowest levels of unemployment we've had for a long time. It's around 5%, down from 11% in the early 1990s. We've got record numbers of men and women completing higher education, more women than men actually are graduating with bachelor's degrees in Australia. We've got strong health and medical services and strong medical research. In fact, one of my colleagues at the University of Queensland has invented a cure or a prevention for cervical cancer. So there's a lot of very positive trends in Australia, as I'm sure similarly in New Zealand. So it's puzzling then that given all of those advances and that basis, why we are still talking about social disadvantage and inequality. And I want to talk a little bit about some research that's recently been published by the Australian Productivity Commission. They've just recently published a report taking a stock take of the evidence. Rising Inequality ? Was the title of the report. And this is one of the graphs in the report. And what it shows is that median weekly incomes have risen dramatically over the last 30 years or so. Nevertheless, the relative poverty rate, defined as less than 50% of median income, has remained remarkably stable. So despite all of the advances that I just outlined, despite the strong economy, those benefits are not shared by all. And there's a group of Australians at the bottom of the hierarchy or the income distribution who are continually missing out. And there's been no change in that trend. So as our Productivity Commission Chairman, Peter Harris, quoted or stated in a report, came out a media release around the report, for about 2 million or so people, we are where we were 30 years ago. The proportion of our society apparently doing very poorly should have reduced over that 30 years. But this is not happening, and there's clear evidence in Australia of entrenched or deep and persistent disadvantage, and we're not making any headway into reducing that. Now, turning to a life course approach, of course the consequences of that kind of inequality are not just felt by the current generation, but they have long-term intergenerational effects. And this is probably a fairly well-known graph from one of our partner investigators in the Life Course Centre, Professor Miles Korak, who was at University of Ottawa. He's now at CUNY in New York. And what the graph shows is the relationship between income inequality on the bottom and intergenerational earnings elasticity. Now, the income inequality is measured by the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of, it's a summary measure of the overall distribution of income, wealth and consumption. A value of 1 means perfect equality, everyone has the same income. A value of 0 is perfect equality, a value of 1 is perfect inequality, with everybody, with one person having all the income. So it ranges from 0 to 1. The earnings elasticity is a percentage difference in earnings in the child's generation that's associated with the percentage difference in the parental generation. So it's a measure of mobility across generations. And a higher figure here means a very strong correlation between what parents earn and what children earn. And of course, less mobility means less chance to move up the hierarchy. And what you see here is that New Zealand, Australia, Canada cluster in the middle, UK, US, Italy up the top, and the Nordic countries down in that bottom left-hand corner. And what the graph and the analyses behind it show is that more inequality is associated with less mobility. So less chance to move up the hierarchy, less chance to move out of that very close relationship between your parents' situation and your situation. And this graph has been used in a number of reports. It's been cited widely. It's repeated again in the Productivity Commission. And I think it just really clearly shows just one indicator of how income inequality doesn't just affect the current generation in terms of living standards and opportunities, but it carries over into the opportunities that are available to children and the next generation. So there are long-lasting effects of inequality. So we know a lot already about inequality, what causes it, what are the consequences. We know, and I'm going to use the term disadvantage because I think that's a broader term that encompasses a broader range of issues. We know that disadvantage or inequality is not random. We know that it's dynamic, so people move in and out of disadvantage over the life course. We know that it's multidimensional, so the previous graph was looking at income inequality, but I think it's important to look at other forms of disadvantage, so health disadvantage, social isolation, other forms of social well-being. We know that disadvantage is cumulated or correlated, so if you experience one form of disadvantage, you're more likely to experience another. For example, if you experience unemployment, you're more likely to experience health disadvantage, you're more likely to experience social isolation. And that makes it more complex, but it also shines a light on where we might intervene. And it does suggest that if we intervene in one of those areas, there may be flow-on effects to other forms of disadvantage. So although it adds to the complexity of understanding people's lives, it also shines a light on the fact that improving in one area may have flow-on effects to others. We know that disadvantage varies across social groups, so it's not random. And so what that means, of course, is that the playing field is not level for all families and children. And as the previous graph showed, entrenched inequality pulls the rungs of the ladder apart, making it harder for children to move up the ladder and move out of the circumstances into which they're born. In Australia, we know that there's an elevated risk of disadvantage becoming entrenched for particular groups. And the Productivity Commission report, as well as a report that was released just this week, Anti-Poverty Week by ACOS, has shown that the chances of experiencing disadvantage is elevated for particular groups. So people living in single-parent families, people who are unemployed, people with disabilities, Indigenous Australians who experience by far the highest rates of disadvantage. And as I mentioned, we know that these disadvantage outcomes are correlated. So if you experience one, you're more likely to experience another. And the risks are particularly elevated for children living in jobless households. And report after report shows this very clearly. Now, I'm kind of slipping between talking about poverty, inequality, disadvantage. As I mentioned, I think disadvantage is a better term for my purposes than just poverty or inequality. Poverty and inequality typically make people think of income inequality or economic, financial inequality. I think certainly in our centre we are concerned with social disadvantage more broadly. And I think that the term disadvantage is more inclusive, covers a whole range of areas that go well beyond income and economic inequality. And in this slide, I'm showing you data from our Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia panel. This is our large-scale household panel survey that commenced in 2001. It interviews everybody in the household. It goes back to the household every year, follows people if they move out of the household. It's our large-scale household panel survey funded by the Australian government. It's been running since 2001 with around 7,000 households in wave one and well over 13,000 individuals. And what this graph shows is a measure that's been created on the basis of the characteristics listed down the side, so low income, missing out financially, which is measured by difficulty in paying basic household bills like heating, food, rent, labour force participation, education, health, social support, community participation and personal safety. So this is a fairly comprehensive measure of social disadvantage, which, as you can see, goes well beyond economic indicators. And the graph shows the percentage of people in the Hilda survey in disadvantage between 2001 and 2012. The marginal disadvantage measure are people who have just one form of disadvantage, one of those characteristics. And you can see around 35% of the Hilda sample could be characterised as marginally disadvantaged. Deep disadvantage are people who experience at least two forms of disadvantage. And then the very deep, which is the bottom line in the graph, are people who experience three or more forms of disadvantage. And as you would expect, the very deeply disadvantaged people are just over the bottom of the graph, so around 2-3%. Those who are deeply disadvantaged, just over 5%. The marginally disadvantaged, around 35%. And you can see also that the marginal disadvantaged group bounces around a bit. So people move in and out of being marginally disadvantaged over time. But the deeply disadvantaged and the very deeply disadvantaged, even though they're much lower percentage of the sample, are very constant over time. There's no change at all, virtually, in those who are classified as very deeply disadvantaged. And again, I think this goes back to the point from the first graph of the proportion of people in Australia who are in entrenched or deep disadvantage economically. We see the same trend here when we take a much broader measure, that the people who experience many forms of disadvantage, there's no change. It's very difficult to budge that line at the bottom. Now, Hilda, of course, this is not necessarily a representative sample. Hilda is a longitudinal panel. It was representative in 2001. Of course, over time, as a longitudinal survey, we lose representativeness. So this is not necessarily representative in terms of the overall figures in Australia, but I think the trends are really important to point to. And it does suggest that the groups that we should be really focused on in tackling this problem are those who experience multiple forms of disadvantage. So the deeply disadvantaged and persistently disadvantaged. Okay, so final graph in part one, just again from the Productivity Commission report, just showing where Australia sits amongst the OECD countries. We're in about the middle of the pack amongst developed countries in terms of income inequality. And New Zealand sits there in about roughly the same position. So it's always the Nordic countries who are doing much better in this area. I think we can learn a lot. And the United States tends to be the outlier in many of these graphs in terms of high levels of inequality, low levels of mobility. So I want to move on now to the second part of the talk. And I want to introduce the Life Course Centre. This is a centre that I direct that started in 2014. As I said, it's primarily funded by the Australian Research Council. It's a national centre. It's a collaboration between 4 universities, UQ, University of Sydney, Melbourne and Western Australia. In 2014, we were awarded approximately $20 million from the ARC. And then we had additional funding from the universities and various government departments. We're only the second ARC Centre of Excellence in the social sciences. So typically this funding goes to the hard sciences, to the engineers and the biologists, and I was very pleased that social science got up on this occasion. We're in our 5th year of running, and I'm just writing the grant for another 7 years of funding, so we'll see how that goes. We'll find out sometime next year. In addition to the Australian universities, we've partnered with a number of international universities around the world where there are experts in social disadvantage, inequality, intergenerational mobility, and these are our international partner universities. And we're funded to do a number of different things. So we are primarily a research centre, so we are funded to identify the drivers of deep and persistent disadvantage, and that's our key focus on that group of people who are at the bottom of the distribution, where there doesn't seem to be any change in rates of deep and persistent disadvantage. But we're also funded to, as well as doing the research, do something about it. So a big part of our research and our activities is around developing and trialling new solutions in policy and practice. So developing new social interventions, trialling them, piloting them, and then, if appropriate, looking for ways to scale them up and roll them out. So research, impact in the form of new interventions, providing advice to our government partners. The third important area is training the next generation of research leaders, of life course researchers. And that's a big part of what we do. So we are using quite a bit of our funding to recruit PhD students, postdoctoral fellows. We run a lot of training courses, and we're hoping that when we, the chief investigators and partner investigators, move on and retire, there'll be a whole new generation of life course researchers who will pick up where we're up to and keep running with it. And I think that's a really important part of what we're trying to do. We're also working to build capacity across our government and non-government organisations. So in addition to our PhDs and postdocs, we run a lot of training courses for our government partners, and those courses cover things like longitudinal methods, social intervention development, evaluation design. We work with a lot of our service providers, our NGOs, to help them to build their capacity in evaluation work. In Australia and maybe in New Zealand as well, a lot of effort, a lot of money is put into programs and policies which simply don't work. We see this particularly in our Indigenous populations, but right across the board. We know they don't work, but yet they are funded repeatedly. And there are political reasons, of course, why this often happens, but it's really a waste of time. And certainly in terms of Indigenous disadvantage, the gap is getting larger in Australia, not smaller. In some of the education results for school children, if we look at PISA results comparing Australia to other countries, Australia's falling behind in some of those indicators as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, not just in terms of the research, because sometimes we know what the answers are or we have good ideas, but there's not a great deal of political will to change what we've been doing for a long time. We're also working very hard to develop access to data and technical infrastructure. So Australia has invested very heavily in a number of large-scale longitudinal panel surveys. So I mentioned our HILDA survey. We also have our longitudinal study of Australian children, which has been running since 2004. We've had a number of other panel surveys. We've had a longitudinal study of homeless people, Journeys Home. We've got a longitudinal study of women's health. a longitudinal study of men's health, which is just getting underway. We've had a longitudinal study of refugees and humanitarian migrants. A lot of resources have been directed toward collecting really good quality longitudinal evidence, and that has been terrific, and they've been hugely successful. What we haven't done, and what I believe New Zealand has done a lot better than Australia, is open up our wealth of data and administrative holdings. So one of the goals of the Life Course Centre was to work closely with our government partners to have a look at what data are routinely collected around social security payments, health, education, and how can we make that data more accessible and more openly available for analysis. And we've had some success there, and I'll talk a little bit about that again in a moment, but there's a long way to go, and I don't think that Australia is as advanced in this area as New Zealand, where I believe you've got a very nice integrated data infrastructure, which is nicely streamlined and routinely available, and that hasn't been the case in Australia, not yet, but we're working toward it. The other part of our vision is to really strengthen the relationship between academics in universities, community, non-government organisations, and government partners. So we are really trying very hard to build strong partnerships around research projects, and that means not just taking the money from government and going off and doing our research. It means sitting at the table and coming up with joint projects and deep partnerships and revisiting those and trying to really work in collaboration. And that's been challenging for a whole range of reasons. We've had some success. And then finally, we wanted to destigmatise social disadvantage. We want to keep it on the agenda. I think there is a tendency to think that everybody is doing well. Australia is a rich country, high in natural resources. We've had a mining boom. A lot of attention is focused rightly on other important issues like the environmental challenge, but this is still an area that is not solved yet. So we want to keep social disadvantage on the agenda and also destigmatise the way that it's thought about and analysed. We are a multidisciplinary centre, so we are a broad cross-section of researchers from a whole range of areas. I'm a sociologist. We've got psychologists, economists, criminologists, population scientists, statisticians, and others. As we move into our next funding phase, we are bringing in some additional disciplines outside the social sciences, so engineers, IT experts, urban designers, and trying to broaden out even further. The IT people are going to be particularly important in terms of some of the new data science techniques that we hope to move into. The urban designers, particularly important in terms of understanding how we can tackle disadvantage at a community level. And we've grown enormously, so we're well over 230 researchers and affiliates across the world. As I mentioned, we're partnered with a number of government agencies. The Australian Government Department of Social Services is probably our key partner. And I haven't listed all the partners here, but we're also partnered with Department of Education, Department of Employment. Australian Institute of Health and Welfare is a key partner, and they're particularly important because they are an integrated data authority, and it's through them that we're able to access some of the administrative data. We're partnered with Brotherhood St Lawrence and Wesley Mission, two community organisations. And broadly speaking, despite our diversity, we all share a broad life course approach. And I've just put up here the key life course principles that underlie a lot of the research that we do. These will be well known to all of you who have studied life course research. We know that people's lives are linked. So that graph I showed you at the beginning from Korak's work, parents and children, siblings, but also across communities. People's lives are lived interdependently. The timing of events in the life course is very important. So particular transitions that people move through, it's not just important in terms of moving successfully through transitions, but the timing of transitions and the sequencing of transitions. So the age at which you have your first child, for example, whether or not you have a first child within a stable relationship, the age at which you leave school, the age at which you leave home, all of those are important life course transitions, and the sequence or the ordering in which they occur also affect outcomes. The time and place, so we know that people's lives are shaped by the historical context that they live in, and also their community is incredibly important to outcomes. We know that human development and ageing are lifelong processes, so in our centre we focus primarily on the early years through to about middle age. That's largely a function of the data that we have access to. We have some research on ageing, but we focus primarily on the earlier years. And of course, human agency. So although people's lives are constrained by the place and the context and the structures that they're faced with, people also make decisions and they have agency. So it's important to look at individuals in context in terms of the way in which people construct their lives. And this next graphic just shows, I guess, a life course approach in a schematic way. You can think of that line across the middle as any kind of outcome that you might be interested in, whether it's a health outcome, earnings outcome, a well-being, satisfaction, life satisfaction outcome, whatever it might be. No matter at what point in that line that you're interested in, if you're interested in infant outcomes or what happens during childhood or adolescence, it's really important to know what's happened beforehand. So if you really want to understand what's going on in an adolescent's life, it's very important to know something about their childhood, the context in which they've lived their life. And of course, this is really just a nice way of showing a kind of a life course approach with the prompts and the facilitators as well as the constraints in terms of families, communities and society in which they live. Okay, so, a couple more slides on the centre. This is just, in terms of our research, we have 3 broad programs of research. Of course, they're all very overlapping, but we're interested in research on disadvantaged systems, so the structural constraints that shape life course outcomes, education system, welfare system, labour markets, and so on. We also do a lot of research on human capabilities. So how can we improve human capabilities through interventions in education or health, parenting, to improve outcomes? And then the third program is around social transformation. What can we do to have some impact in people's lives? How can we change disadvantage over the life course? So systems, capabilities and transformation are the 3 broad thematic programs. And of course they're overlapping. what we do doesn't fall neatly into one of those programs, but that's how we think about our focus. Okay, so I want to turn now to part 3, which is to talk about some of the research. And I think what separates the Life Course Centre from other research initiatives is the focus on the translational component. So we don't just want to describe or try to isolate the key causes of disadvantage, but we're also trying to develop the innovative solutions to address it. That takes time, of course, and so some of our impact and outcomes, I suspect, will happen, I hope will happen some way down the track. We're looking at how people construct their lives to identify the drivers of disadvantage, and also focusing on the critical life course junctures and opportunities for social interventions. So at what point is it best to intervene to improve outcomes? And as I mentioned, a lot of our research is focused on early interventions that take place early in the life course, in the anticipation that intervening early will improve outcomes further down the track. So I'm going to start off with a couple of the broader large-scale projects. And as I mentioned, one of the big areas that we've tried to focus on, and this was a big impetus for building the centre in the first place, is although Australia has invested very heavily in some terrific longitudinal surveys, we haven't made much headway yet in terms of accessing and analysing the wealth of administrative data that governments routinely collect and other organisations. We've made some headway in this area, and these are just some of the activities that we've undertaken. So in 2014, when we were first funded, we set up a data for policy group. We brought all of our government partners together into the one room to talk about what data they routinely collect. It was a really amazing event because it was the first time many of those departments had been together in the same room to talk about their data. And so there were some very interesting conversations from Department of Employment, talking to people from Department of Education, and DSS saying, oh, do you collect that data too? Oh, well, we have that data and we do it this way. And so it was quite an eventful, eye-opening experience, not just for us, but for some of our partners who had never talked to their colleagues in other departments about what data they collect. We had our first international conference in 2015, and Bill English was our keynote speaker, one of our keynotes, telling us about the New Zealand example. And we've looked across at New Zealand quite enviously at your integrated data infrastructure. We've then co-partnered with Department of Social Services to run another conference in Canberra, the National Centre for Longitudinal Data, again trying to build the impetus to understand what administrative data the government was collecting and how we might use it. We held an international workshop at Stanford in 2017 that one of your colleagues, Andrew Spall, attended, looking around the world at what other countries do. And now we've contributed just recently to an issues paper, and we are seeing headway in this area. So the Australian government is starting to link and develop integrated data holdings, but we've got a long way to go in terms of making that data available to researchers. That's been one of the main goals of the centre, to work closely with our government partners to understand what data are available, bring them together, and then build the capacity to analyse those data. Another project which we're working on at the moment, which comes out of the Australian Priority Investment Approach, is around the Try, Test and Learn initiative. And Try, Test and Learn is a government initiative to call for proposals from around the country, from community groups, from academics, from organisations, to develop new social interventions to help disadvantaged people who may be at risk of long-term welfare dependence. And the groups that they focused on in Tranche 1 of Try, Test and Learn were young parents, young carers and young students. And about 14 projects were funded around the country focused on new interventions that might support those groups to move out of long-term welfare dependence. It's been quite an innovative approach. So this wasn't your typical funding call where groups were competing against each other for scarce resources. What the government did in contrast is to call for proposals and then bring people together and co-design a number of projects. So people were brought together, projects were co-designed across groups in collaboration with government, and then funding was given to the amalgamated groups to roll out the programs. So it's quite an innovative and different approach to what we've seen before in Australia. And the role of the Life Course Centre is to work with those 14 different projects to help them build capacity to roll out the intervention, whatever it might be. And there's a whole range of different types of interventions around mentoring, job seeking, educational pathways. A whole range of different types of programs have been funded. Our job is to work with them to build capacity to roll out the intervention and to help them undertake an appropriate evaluation of that intervention. So we're working to build their capacity to collect the appropriate data and analyse it to understand whether or not the program has been successful. So we are really, I guess, a helping hand with each of the projects. And then we're also funded to do an overall evaluation of Try, Test and Learn. Tranche 2 of TTL is now just being funded. I think there may be another 50 or so projects that will be funded later this year, focusing on a range of different groups. So the unemployed, people over 50, refugees, and a number of other groups are the focus of Tranche 2. So I think Try, Test and Learn is a really potentially innovative way to develop new projects, to take away some of that competition between groups who are vying for scarce resources, and also to evaluate them appropriately. So if these projects are not working, if these interventions are not shown to be delivering what they promise, then the intention is that they would be defunded and new projects would be trialled. So I'm quite optimistic that this is perhaps moving beyond some of what we've seen in the past in terms of how we've tackled social disadvantage. Another major project that the Life Course Centre is involved in is the Every Family study. Now, this is looking at the effectiveness of the PPP positive parenting program. I don't know if people here know about PPP, but it's a parenting program that was developed by Professor Matt Sanders, a psychologist at the University of Queensland. It's been trialled across a number of different countries. Indications that it works well to improve parenting practices and then in turn improve outcomes for children. It's a layered system of parenting training, so it can provide very light touch parenting training through communication strategies, as well as right through to more intensive training for very, I don't like to use the word dysfunctional, but families that are in need of intensive intervention. And just after we were funded in the Life Course Centre, the Queensland Government announced that it would roll Triple P out to the whole of the Queensland state. So every family in Queensland who wanted to access Triple P was given access to this new parenting strategy. So it's been rolled out, and well over 200,000 families in Queensland have now accessed some form of Triple P parenting training. And of course the intention is that by improving parenting, you can not only improve the lives of parents who are struggling with parental responsibilities, but also improve the outcomes for children. And now what we're doing in the Life Course Centre is we're following the implementation of Triple P in 38 highly disadvantaged communities in Queensland. So we've chosen our 38 communities, and we are going to compare results in those communities with similar communities in terms of socio-demographic characteristics in New South Wales, where Triple P is not being rolled out. And we're going to be using administrative data on things like NAPLAN, our national education results, on literacy and numeracy, hospitalisation rates, out-of-home care, maltreatment results, a whole range of indicators, school attendance, as well as we're conducting our own surveys looking at measures of parental well-being and family life and family relationship quality. And of course what we're hoping to understand is whether this large-scale population rollout of a parenting program with different levels of intervention improves outcomes for children, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And one of the innovative things that we're trying to test is whether or not there's a spillover effect. So even if a particular family does not receive Triple P training, is there a spillover effect, a saturation level effect, where if enough people in the community receive Triple P, is there a saturation spillover effect where we see whole communities improving in terms of these rates of disadvantage? So it's much more like a population health intervention, similar to what we've seen with things like rates of smoking. So rather than treating the symptoms after they occur, it's a prevention exercise to see what impact we can have at community levels, particularly in disadvantaged communities, by rolling out Triple P. So this is a large-scale project. It will take a number of years, of course, before we're able to really assess the effects. We're undertaking the surveys at the moment. We need to wait until there's enough saturation in our 38 communities to really see if we can measure these community level effects. We need to access the administrative data. We're working closely with the Queensland Government, New South Wales Government, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare to access the relevant data. And that's proven tricky. So yes, they're all on board, they're at the table, we co-designed the project. Now we need to look at the data, and that's slow. But we are working toward it. So that's one of our flagship projects, which is multidisciplinary, multinodal, multisectoral, working with our community organisations, our government partners, and it's an ongoing large-scale project. Another one is a project that's led by my colleague at University of Sydney, Deborah Cobb-Clark, which is looking specifically at the intergenerational transmission of welfare support. And what Deb and her colleagues have done is to take a cohort of individuals born between 1987 and 1988 and match them with their parents using government administrative data. So it's not a full population sample. They've got around 124,000 matched youth and parent pairs. It's a transgenerational data set that they're building. And they're then looking at the correlation, well, they're looking at a range of things, but one of the things they're looking at is the correlation between whether or not parents are on welfare support and children. So are the children of those parents then more likely to be on welfare support? And they're breaking it down, looking at correlations between different kinds of welfare support, so unemployment benefit versus disability support versus parenting payment single, parenting payment partnered. And what they found, this is one of the papers that you can read in detail on our Life Course Centre website. We have a working paper series. We've got well over 100 papers published there. So a version of this paper is also on our website, published in 2017. One of the things they found is that young people are 1.8 times more likely to need social assistance, welfare support, if their parents have a history of receiving social assistance. So a strong correlation between parental and children's outcomes in terms of welfare support. The relationship is particularly strong in the case of single parent payments, disability payments and carer payments, so 1.6 times. Children are 1.6 times more likely to receive social assistance if their parents have been on one of those payments. The rates are still, the correlations are still significant, but less so if parents have been on partnered parent payments and unemployment payments, 1.3 to 1.4 times higher. And so in the paper, Deb and her colleagues talk about what this means for some of the pathways. What does this point us toward in terms of the mechanisms driving that correlation? So parental disability and single parenthood seem to be some of the clearest pathways through which intergenerational disadvantage is passed from Australian parents to their children. Poor labour market outcomes, as indicated by New Start, which is our unemployment, seems to be easier for young people to overcome intergenerationally. Now, they've done a lot more in the paper, and I haven't done justice to it. They look at the length of time parents have been on welfare as well, so what they call the intensity of welfare support, and look at how that then correlates with children's outcomes. But this, again, is another of our large-scale, multidisciplinary, ongoing projects. It's taken a number of years to build this data set, and the results are now just coming out in terms of looking at the correlations between parental welfare support and children's outcomes. Now, in the final part of the talk, and I don't know how I'm going for time here, I'm just going to keep going until someone tells me to stop. But I want, in the final part of my talk, to move on to a couple of smaller projects, particularly around family dynamics, which is the area that I'm particularly interested in. This is some of the research that I've undertaken personally in the centre with my colleagues. And I just want to of course, with the very valuable longitudinal data sets like HILDA, LSAC, I didn't mention the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. There's quite a lot of important longitudinal data available in Australia now where we can really look at family dynamics and how that influences social disadvantage outcomes. And so I just wanted to show you a couple of examples from research that I've done with some of my colleagues, looking at how family dynamics or family structures influence outcomes for children and adults. And this is from a paper using our longitudinal study of Australian children with colleagues. It's been published now in Child Indicators Research. I believe it's also one of our working papers, where we've just looked at how different family structures relate to socio-emotional development of children at around the age of 5. And so we've got a socio-emotional scale, very well known, well validated scale, which I'm sure is used in a number of studies around the world, including in your own, growing up in New Zealand, here in New Zealand. So a higher score means poorer socio-emotional development on this scale. And across the bottom, it's just a cross-sectional snapshot, in this case, of family structure. So the first bar are children around the age of 5 who've never lived in a family with 2 biological parents, children whose family was ruptured, divorce or separation or other by the age of 4, right down to children who've always lived in a biological family with 2 parents. And what you see, and these are models controlling for a whole range of other indicators like income, gender of the child, indigeneity, ethnicity, birth weight, age of mother, and so on, a whole range of controls. And what we see very clearly just in this snapshot is that family structure does influence socio-emotional development of children at around age 5. And so those who've never lived in a biological 2-parent family are doing the poorest in terms of this particular measure. Those who've always lived in that kind of family with those kinds of resources are doing the best. Now, we don't know in this snapshot what's driving those differences. We need to do, of course, a lot more work to understand the mechanisms underlying those variations. Is it parenting time? Is it resources? Although, as I said, we've controlled for at least household income. Is it variations in time that children receive? Is it other characteristics? So this is really, I guess, a puzzle which we've gone on to look at further. But even from this snapshot, you can see there's a very strong policy implication here that if we do have resources to invest in families or young children, this points to how we might use those resources best in terms of which children might benefit most from additional support and resources. Another snapshot, same kind of focus, I suppose. This time we're using data from HILDA, Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia, and we're looking at the history. So these are adults in HILDA who are aged between 20 and 69 who experienced separation or divorce when they were a child. And we're looking at how that experience and the age at which the child was when that occurred affects wealth when they're adults. And so we've got wealth measures. Wealth is categorised a whole, property, financial assets, savings, insurance, superannuation, and so on, minus debt, so mortgages, loans, etc. So quite a comprehensive measure of wealth is possible using the Hilda data. The Reserve Bank put in funds to Hilda in 1 year of the survey, and in return they developed and asked for a very large module on wealth. And now that's been repeated every few years, so it's got excellent wealth data. And what you see here, again, so parental divorce is associated with lower wealth as adults. So if you've been fortunate enough to grow up in a family where there's been no separation between the age of 20 and 69, your wealth holdings will be larger than your counterparts who were not so fortunate. Again, these models are controlling for a whole range of other characteristics, and it doesn't say anything here in this graph about the mechanisms. So is this lower wealth acquisition due to the reduced educational attainment of children who experience divorce and separation? Is it due to the unstable family structures that might have resulted from that separation? Is it due to reduced wealth transfers from adults to children? So if your parents separated, maybe there's not that same intergenerational transfer of wealth as an adult. We've tried to unpack it a bit in the paper. Again, you can read the full paper in the working paper series, where through various statistical models and controlling for different aspects of potential mechanisms, we've tried to isolate what that mechanism might be. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the paper. We can't definitely say what the mechanism is, but the results are very clear in terms of the difference in wealth. Another paper going back to, again, the longitudinal study of Australian children, and here we are trying to start to get at the mechanisms. So we see the overall trends. Well, what's driving some of those trends? And in this paper, what we've tried to do is to use the time use diary data in LSAC to look at how parents spend time with children. So I'm not sure if you've got a similar time diary data in growing up in New Zealand. The time diary data is extremely valuable. It's a pain to collect, it's expensive, it's messy to analyse, but what you can get out of the time diary data is really useful information. And we've used this data here to look at the developmental gradient in the way parents spend time with children. There's been some research in the US which has suggested that not only do more educated parents spend more time with children, but they spend it in particular ways depending on the age of the child. So more educated mothers will spend more time in the basic care needs of infants. So, feeding, dressing, basic care of young children. As children get older, around toddler years, they spend more time playing with them compared to parents with younger children. Then, as the children start to get to school entry, they spend more time in teaching activities, so reading to them, playing educational games. And then as they're older, they spend more time in what we might call enrichment activities, so taking them to music lessons, taking them to sporting activities. And so the developmental gradient has been shown by Ariel Khalil, who's one of our colleagues in the US, to be very evident in the US. And what we did with the Australian data is to look at, do you see the same patterns in Australia? So we do see, like many countries around the world, more educated parents spend more time with children. And that's a very clear finding. But what we also see, like the US, is that more educated parents spend more time doing developmentally appropriate activities with children. So we didn't find it, the NS there, the non-significant, we didn't find it for basic care, but we did find, and the number of stars indicates the statistical significance of the findings, we did find that more educated parents spend a lot more time playing with their children when they're aged 2 to 3, a lot more time in teaching activities when children are 4 to 5, and a lot more time in enrichment activities as children get older. 5 minutes. And the good thing about the Australian data, unlike the US data, I'm not sure about your New Zealand data, is that we know who children are spending their time with. So this is not just time spent with mothers, but we know which adult they're with, and whether it's another adult outside the family. So it doesn't just have to be mothers who are spending time in these activities. So the developmental gradient, we found strong evidence of that in Australia. I've only got a couple more minutes, but I did want to say something about fathers. So we've looked again with the LSAC data at, again, using the time use diary data, at fathers' involvement with children and how that affects children's cognitive outcomes. So this is, the measure here is results on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which ranges from 0 to 100, children aged 4 to 8. We've got 3 waves of data, over 3,000 children, various controls. The red line at the bottom are fathers who don't have a degree. Sorry, the red line at the top are fathers with a degree. The blue line at the bottom are fathers who don't have a degree. You can see that the more time fathers spend with children, the better children do on this measure. You can see there's a clear difference in the educational levels of the fathers in terms of how much time they spend and the outcomes for children. But what we also found is that children do much better on this outcome if fathers spend time in educational activities. So it's not just the amount of time that fathers are spending, but it's the content of that time that's affecting children's outcomes. And so I think it's, and the trend here is pretty significant and pretty clear. Look, I have other information that I wanted to tell you. I've got results here looking at how attitudes change over the life course, looking at parental transitions. One of the surprising things we find, this is with the Hilda data again, and also the British Household Panel Survey, is that when people become parents for the first time, so when they enter parenthood, their attitudes to gender equality becomes more traditional. We find that across both countries, and it's highly significant. The results are substantive. So entry to parenthood seems to be a very important life course transition in terms of a whole range of outcomes for women in terms of their paid work, their unpaid work, but for both men and women in terms of their attitudes to equality. So I think that's an important finding that we need to do more work on to understand what it is about becoming a parent. We know women withdraw from the labour market at that point, typically in Australia, or go part-time. There are good reasons why they do that, because we still don't have gender equality in terms of earnings, so economically it makes sense. But we were surprised by the results on gender attitudes. We also know that becoming a parent affects time pressure, particularly for women, around a first birth, but also around a second birth. And in this paper, we go on to show that that time pressure has important consequences for women's mental health, and much less so for men. So again, entry into parenthood is a critical time point. And then we are just moving into starting to look at some issues around sleep. Sleep science is becoming an important topic, particularly perhaps in our news centre. And what this research shows is that not only are characteristics of individuals, their material deprivation, their their prosperity, their financial situation, not only does that affect their sleep quantity, but also the local context, so the geographical context or the employment context in which they live. So if you are in an area with a high rate of unemployment and you suffer from material deprivation, your sleep quantity goes down much more steeply than if you don't have one of those characteristics. So I think there's a lot to investigate there around sleep, and I think sleep is another important measure of well-being that we might have overlooked. So I'll finish there with this quote. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. And that's really what the Life Course Centre and I think Life Course research more generally can help us do. So thank you very much. And that's the website if you want to follow up on anything that I've spoken about. Thank you very much.